please introduce Tony Calcaterra, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's Audience Measurement Team. Tony, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad you could join us today to talk about a subject that's just incredibly important, both to us and to Affluents in general. I am going to turn off my video so that we can focus on the presentation. And let's get started. So, today we're going to cover a lot of information like we normally do. The insights that we're going to present are really derived from two sources: our ongoing Ipsos Affluence study in the USA, along with these in-depth studies we conduct virtually every quarter as part of our barometer studies. Our US Affluence study is part of Ipsos's 49-country global effort that provides clients with what we like to refer to as a total understanding of affluent consumers, who they are, what they buy, how what they use, how they think, and ultimately for clients, how can they effectively reach them and speak to them in the most persuasive way. As we've seen many times, the reason why we stay on top of the affluent market is really tied to the fact that as a group, they are perhaps the single most important market in the world. They only account for a quarter of U.S. households, but affluents control nearly 3/4 of total U.S. net worth, and they consistently outspend non-affluent households by greater than 2.5 to 1. So, as a block, they're critically important to every marketer, especially when general consumer spending starts to pull back, and we're going to talk more about that. As always, we plan to cover a lot of stuff. So we're going to start by looking at how affluents are feeling right now. Since so much of what they think and do is really tied to their general outlook in life. Knowing their current state of mind, we can look at how affluents really turn to media for everything from just staying abreast of world developments to finding a bit of sanctuary in sort of this crazy world. Not surprisingly, there's going to be significant generational skews when it comes to media behavior. So we'll spend some time looking at that. We'll look at where the differences are, where the similarities are between the ages. We'll then turn to the important topic of when affluents are most accessible through their media choices, before we focus some time on the importance of streaming video on demand in their lives. From there, we're going to spend some time talking about affluents' relationship with streaming and focus in on binge watching, which I know we're all a little bit guilty of. So we'll spend some time on that. And then we're going to shift focus a little bit to explore podcasting in more in depth, since so many media brands have extended their content dissemination through the use of exceptional podcasts. Finally, we will try to tie this all up in a wonderful bow and summarize it into a few salient points for you to take back to work. So let's get started. First, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the emotional state and the psyche of the affluent market. We often talk about the financial insulation that affluents possess. It enables them to stave off any negative impacts from the U.S. economy or from the malaise that we find ourselves in. But these are particularly difficult times, and while most affluents are not facing financial hardship, general fears may be settling in, and that could cause some changes in consumer behavior. Now remember, changes in affluent spending have a huge implications for the economy as a whole. Those top earning households outspend, and therefore they're going to impact virtually every market sector, from food and groceries to beverage alcohol. That's an area where affluent households account for almost half of the total spend in the US, so critically important. Now, for most of the past 15 years, we've been measuring through our barometers economic optimism. Affluents have been largely optimistic about the economy moving forward during that time. During the Great Recession, we did see brief periods where bears overtook bulls in terms of economic outlook. But once we got past the Great Recession, then optimism really triumphed over pessimism until COVID hit in 2020. Now, we did see, thankfully, as affluence adjusted to what was euphemistically called the new normal, optimism returned. Unfortunately, we now face the scourge of historically high inflation that hit us earlier this year. And in our most recent measure, the pessimists have come much higher, and they now outweigh optimists 43% to 37%. However, it should be noted that most of the pessimism is centered around the mass affluent population. As the higher your income is, the more likely you are to see a positive outlook for the economy. And in fact, among those households with a household net worth of $5 million or more, we see nearly 2/3 of them are bullish on the U.S. economy. Now, all of that said, we see, good optimism amongst the highest earners and highest net assets, but there are still concerns about inflation that are affecting all income levels. It is the number one concern among all groups of affluents, with the exception of Black and African affluent Americans, where the issue of racial inequality is 3 times higher than the concern about inflation. And that's a trend that we have seen throughout our measurement, and it's quite concerning, obviously. Now, getting back to inflation, regardless of income, the majority of Americans, both affluent and non-affluent, expect their purchasing habits to change over the next 6 months. A little bit more than half of them are telling us that they're likely to buy fewer products overall, while 4 in 10 expect to wait a little bit longer, seek out sales when they decide to make purchases. But what is important, and that we want people to remember, is that affluent households, are going to have the financial wherewithal in order to be able to afford these things. So despite higher prices, they're less likely to be squeezed out of the market. So companies really do need to focus on these high-income households in order to make up for shortfalls that may rack up as a result of lower-income households pulling back even further. Now, the reason why we say that we think that you should focus on them is relatively simple. That despite the concerns about inflation, close to 3/4 of affluent households are telling us that their family finances are the same or better than they were compared to a year ago. They also happen to be pretty confident about the future, with even more of them saying that they'll hold their ground or be better off 6 months from now. So despite their concerns about the economy, despite their concerns about inflation, they do feel fairly immune personally to the problems that are facing the nation as a whole. It comes as no surprise then, if you look deeper, that the higher your income, the greater your confidence is about your family finances. So those living in households that earn $250,000 or more are 6 percentage points more likely to say their finances are better compared to last year than even affluents in the 125 to 249,000 range. This highest income earners, these 250,000 plus, are 12 percentage points higher than non-affluents in terms of feeling that their finances are better today than they were a year ago. Now, with more at stake, it's no wonder then that 61% of affluents, feel or keep up with the financial news and have this feeling of a constant need to know. They want the immediacy of online news to keep them informed. And it's one of the reasons, and it's not the only one, that keeps affluents chained to media brands. And I say change, but I mean it in a good way. And that's why I call them media junkies. They're craving a connection to intelligence, to knowledge about themselves and the world around them. In many ways, affluents have a FOMO, that fear of missing out. Really, that can only be assuaged by an almost constant connection to media. I might be exaggerating a bit, but you'll see the connection is quite deep and very wide. In an average week, affluents spend more than 60 hours per week with media. That's roughly half of the waking hours in a typical week. Following a trend that we've seen for some time, men are more likely to have higher levels of media time, especially watching live sports compared to women. Though it's likely that the outcome of women unfairly taking on more household responsibility, particularly as there's more working from home and more issues of schooling, it's likely that that is why their media consumption is lower than men. So frankly, here's to women getting the chance to relax and enjoy some time away from the pressures of everyday life. Now, you may ask, and I do, how on earth could affluent consumers spend this much time with media? Now, it's partly because they're what I call media omnivores, which is that they're consuming media across all sorts of different platforms in a typical week. In fact, an average of 8.5 different platforms. Television, video is the most popular connection with media brands, whether it's live, recorded, or streamed. Social media is virtually tied for the percentage of affluents engaged in that platform in a typical week. And despite some people considering them old school, publications in AM/FM radio still engage a huge portion of affluents, with both of those bringing their own unique ability to connect and engage. In fact, audio as a whole, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail, as a whole, despite what the Buggles sang years ago, video did not kill the radio stars. There's a tremendous impact of audio on younger generations. Now, we've been tracking media consumption for many years, but over the last 4 years, we've tracked media usage by format to see how it's changing. We all know ad nauseum about how the pandemic upended our lives, and some of those changes continue to impact us. But while affluents have returned to the office, at least partially returned, the trend towards increased work from home opportunities, fewer hours commuting, has led to more time for media. Yes, some of that time is in the background. Some of it is not full attention media consumption. But let's look at some of the trends over the last 4 years. So live TV, which has always had high penetration among affluents, remains ubiquitous, although it's slightly lower than the peak we saw in the worst days of the pandemic. On-demand TV has continued to gain acceptance, while DVR usage has declined over the last 4 years. Now, at the same time, streaming has leapfrogged over live TV, and watching online videos has gained more than 20 percentage points. So big changes in the video side of things. Now, as commuting to the office has returned or begun to return, we're seeing AM/FM radio levels returning back to pre-pandemic levels, as are satellite radio levels. And ultimately, thanks to the younger generations, streaming radio continues to expand. And downloaded music also returned to pre-pandemic levels as things like returning to gyms, workout routines, all of those things. Now, the other side of it is that the greatest expansion has really occurred in the podcast realm. And we're going to go into that in more detail in a little bit. But it's particularly true because the number of offerings has expanded greatly, and affluents are certainly finding this an appealing way to spend time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, reading publications, which we only started measuring during the pandemic and to now, it's enjoying an expansion among affluents. And I think that's in part to their increasing digital offerings, as well as the other things that they're doing in terms of content dissemination. Finally, social media, which we started measuring last year, I think is really an almost constant presence in affluent lives. Now, we saw just how many affluents were enjoying these media platforms in a typical week. But what's amazing is the total number of hours. It continues to increase. I mentioned earlier that affluents spend a total of 60.5 hours with 12 different media types. Now, for the last 4 years, we tracked 10 of those consistently from just before COVID to just recently. And each year, we've seen an overall increase in media hours among these 10 different types. Now, we did see a sharp increase in overall time this year compared to last. So we wanted to look at the changes and understand just what was going on. Now, during the worst of COVID in Q3 2020, live TV hours rose to an average of 9.4 hours, particularly as we saw in some of our other data, as people turned to news networks, turned to publications, because they were in search of news and understanding about the virus. It's starting to come back down to pre-COVID levels, which makes perfect sense as we return to our normal routines. On-demand TV exposures continue to build, though, and it's almost doubled since the last 4 years. And I think that is an outgrowth of our getting used to the streaming capabilities, and the fact that we can now see the things that we want to see on our schedule as opposed to on a predetermined schedule. Streaming, of course, has expanded, and frankly, it's closing in on live TV hours, at least among the affluents. We're going to talk about that in more detail shortly. Now, while we didn't start measuring time spent with publications until the height of COVID, we are still seeing a sharp increase in the average number of hours reading during the week. And then, honestly, what else is there to say about social media? It's a permanent fixture in our lives, and it continues to grow, particularly as younger people become more affluent. We saw earlier that affluent men were using media more than affluent women across virtually every media type. And what we wanted to look at was, the percentage of women using these services and how they differed. And the fact is that women are using streaming services and online video at close to their male counterparts. And it's really only AM, FM, radio, and social media that are showing higher levels for women. But as I mentioned earlier, we believe that a large part of that is due to the increased burden on women for other household responsibilities that are taking away from their time or their ability to spend time with media. Now, we continue to report on that increasing diversity of younger affluents compared to older affluents, and the differences in their attitudes and behaviors is really quite obvious. Hunger for media itself extends, across all of the generations, but the format preferences are quite different. When we look at this, when I first looked at this data, I thought, oh my God, how is this possible that these younger affluents are consuming twice what older generations do on a weekly basis? And while unfortunately we didn't gather information on simultaneous usage, because it's quite difficult to ask people just exactly what is overlaying what during their day, We do know that based on how much they're consuming and what hours they're consuming it in, that these increased hours for Gen Zs and millennials have more to do with this overlapping media exposure than it does simply that they are spending, inordinately more of their week with media. We divided the media time into 4 buckets for the purposes of this exercise between video, audio, reading, and social media. And what we can see here is that the older generations are devoting the majority of their media time on video, while each successively younger generation is increasing or has an increased proportion that's devoted to audio and social media. And this says a lot about the background side of things, that these are things that are happening while people are living their lives as opposed to being focused on a television set or a magazine. Now, as we look at it in more details, we can see stark differences. So we can see that while live TV is truly important to reach older affluents like boomers and seniors, it's streaming video and watching online videos are going to be critically important to Gen Zs and millennials, and it's certainly less important to those boomers and seniors. Now, with all of this, when we look at the huge amount of time watching videos, the next question usually is, well, what on earth are they watching? Live sports is, the highest rated genre for affluent men. And even though it's less important to women, it still falls within the top 10 choices. We looked at 37 different types of programming. And these are the top 10 choices for men, women, younger generations, middle generations, and the older generations. Movies, as you'll see, are either number 1, 2, or 3 for all of the generations, so they're critically important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to streaming. So with so many offerings and so many different types of content that people look to consume, we wanted to know, we asked respondents, just exactly how do you find new shows to watch? So 1 in 3, about 35% of them, told us that they get interested in a new show because someone they knew was talking about it, which really just comes back to this sense that word of mouth is still incredibly important in driving choice. We already see the impact of streaming services. So, it's not shocking to see that almost 1 in 4 say they get interested based on a recommendation from a streaming service. So, that push to new series or to similar types of content from what they have watched previously is one of those big drivers to making those or to driving people to learn about them. Now, rounding out the top 5 ways, we see TV ads are critically important. Social networking sites where people are sharing information about new series or content. But I found it quite interesting that running into shows by chance on TV was among the top 5. So about 14% of affluents are telling us that's it's just sampling. That's how they find these new shows. So it's time to watch TV. So how do affluents decide what to watch? Well, a quarter of them pick up a series, pick up in the middle of the series they've been watching. 1 in 5 say they peruse the guide or homepage to see what's on that might be interesting to them. And then an equal number are what I call channel loyalists. They simply go to a channel they like and they start watching what's on. Given all of those viewing options on one's own time, it's not surprising that we see that only 6% of them feel they have an appointment time to watch a show at the time it's on. Now, the generational differences are pretty stark, particularly with 4 and 10 Gen Zs saying when they sit down to watch TV, they go back to a series they've been watching. And that really does make complete sense. And, if you think about it, Gen Zs came of age with streaming and binging already established. So they're used to consuming TV content one show at a time when it's convenient for them. For older generations, they learned, quote unquote, learned to watch TV with different shows scheduled on different days of the week. So for them, appointment TV was much more normal than binging and going back to a series when they sat down to watch. And just as there are many types of families, there are many ways in which family media time varies. About half of affluents tell us that family media time is truly family time with everyone in the same room consuming the same media. However, another 21% say that they might all be in the same room, but they're consuming different media. So some are watching TV, some are reading, some are playing games, but it's still considered family media time despite the fact that they're focused in different places. About 1 in 4 tell us that they're in different rooms doing their own thing, while a relatively small minority say they're consuming the same media, but they're consuming it in different rooms. So whether that is they're all watching TV, but they're just watching different programs, or they're all reading or whatever it happens to be, but they're not doing it technically as a family. Now, as I mentioned earlier, audio has just seen just a tremendous growth for younger affluents. And it has a significant presence in their lives, particularly streaming radio, downloaded music, and podcasts. The consistency that we see in AM, FM, and satellite radio is really likely due to the fact that a large part of it is tied to commuting. And as commuting returns, this is going to, keep all of the generations essentially connected. Similarly, downloaded music and podcasts are background listening while people are doing other things. Now, that is likely to explain the differences between generations. Older generations tend to focus more on the very specific thing, whereas the younger generations tend to have a lot of things happening that's multitasking at once. So if you think about many of our work environments, we're used to seeing younger people with headphones listening to music as they work, and their ability to do both at the same time is something that is not necessarily there in the older generations. Now, I do want to point out that on the publishing side, publications are most favored by boomers and seniors, and this is something that publishers know in general. They know that they need to continue their efforts to extend their brand to these newer content formats, especially audio, since we saw how important it is, and potentially immersive technology. That's one of the ways that they're going to be able to increase their appeal to younger generations. That in and of itself is not going to be a problem for social media. We know that there will be generational challenges to the specific platforms, but overall social media is incredibly common for, it's really everyone is doing it on the younger side, less so on the senior side. But as time moves on, as Gen Zs and Millennials become the bulk of the affluent population, we're obviously going to see some changes in the social media format or the platforms. If you think about what Facebook is doing in terms of its shift to the metaverse, we're likely going to be seeing the impact of that over the next several years. So, we now know how many hours, we know which formats they're using. With all of that, you really have to wonder just when are affluents finding the time and when are they engaging with all of it. So since they're spending more than 8 hours a day with media brands in total, it's really no surprise that they're well connected throughout their waking hours. If you look at this, most of the day, more than 50% of affluents are connected to media in some way, in some fashion. And frankly, that isn't much different on the weekends. It's especially true in prime time, when virtually all affluents are exposed to one form of media or another. On the weekends, it might be that they're sleeping a little bit later. During most of the day, there really aren't any clear winners, if you will. Affluents are consuming across the media landscape. Live TV and streaming services are most dominant in the evening. But even so, there are many things that are happening during that time frame. As affluents continue to read, to listen, and watch other forms of media at the same time. Now, one of the interesting findings is how consistently affluents are using social media across the day. So if we look at, from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., virtually more affluents are engaged with social media than any other medium. During dinner time, between 5 and 7, they hold their own against live TV. And during prime time, they lose their lead, but they still maintain a very strong presence. But it's nothing compared to what is happening with TV and streaming services at those hours. There's little drop off in how affluents consume media during the weekend. Again, it looks like they might be sleeping a little bit later, but when we look at this again on the weekend, social media is the dominant player by far. With commuting out of the way from 9 to 5, social media really takes over. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't have information on concurrent usage. For example, we don't know whether people are reading while they're watching TV or posting on social media while they're listening to a podcast. We can tell that during specific time periods, affluents are engaging with multiple forms of media. It peaks at 3.3 different forms between 7 and 10 p.m., making prime time, interestingly, perhaps the most competitive time to gain sole attention. So while it is an opportunity where there are so many people involved, it also may be the most difficult time to get someone's pure focused attention, just because there are so many things happening at the same time. Now, overall, this competition for attention, as I say, is acute most of the day for the youngest affluents. They do have this, a lot of things happening in the background. We think that they are better equipped to be dealing with this multitasking. They fall slightly behind millennials in the overnight to wee hours of the morning. But the fact is that if this is something that will continue as they grow older, it will become an even more complicated media landscape than it currently is, and it's pretty darn complicated right now. So as I was preparing for this presentation, I was drawn to this image from the early 80s, and those of you who are old enough will remember what to me was a very powerful advertisement, except of course in the end I completely misidentified the advertiser. This was an ad for Maxell tapes, not Memorex, And the young man is sort of blown away by the sheer force of music on this new improved cassette tape. So fast forward to today, we really do see a similar disruption happening with video content and distribution. A few years ago, we discovered in our ongoing affluent survey that if Netflix were a TV network, it would be number one among affluents. Now that trend has continued, and in our spring 2022 results, which covered the full year of 2021, they were actually 11 percentage points above the top broadcast networks, NBC and ABC, when it came to the number of affluents that watched in the past week. Frankly, as streaming has grown in popularity, we do see things like Amazon Prime Video and YouTube have leapfrogged many of the established networks. So they now claim the 6th and 7th top slots in terms of where affluents are watching over the course of the week. We'll be releasing our fall data a week from Thursday on September 29th. And it will be interesting to see if these trends continue or if the streaming services are actually moving further up the chain. So according to the barometer that we just conducted, 90% of affluents use a streaming video service. They subscribe or access. And for almost every service that we measured, affluents are far more likely to use those services than non-affluents. The exception is the lower priced Hulu with limited commercials, which has a slight edge among non-affluent households. That has a tremendous impact as we start to see streaming services considering lowering the cost by adding commercial messages during within their services. So it will be interesting to see what happens for Netflix, whether this differential disappears between affluent and non-affluent once there's an offering that lowers the cost. The average affluent household spends 1.6 times what non-affluents currently spend on video streaming services. So they're spending $46.55 per month on average on video streaming services. That number was likely to increase, but we are also seeing at the same time that a number of people are looking at canceling services over the course of the next year. Now, what's behind all of this? What's driving their willingness to spend so much on streaming? Well, it's really their desire to pay for content that they value, and the fact that they're searching for new shows to watch. So to them, streaming services produce better quality shows than regular cable networks. And a majority of affluents say that they subscribe to streaming services specifically for the original content they create. So as we look at this and we look at these comparisons, we see that in every instance here that affluent households or affluent adults are much more in touch with the additional benefits of streaming video. Now, over the last few years, it's also been a growing field. We've seen virtually everybody get involved in the streaming business, including many of the broadcast networks that have created their own streaming platforms. Peacock from NBC, Paramount Plus from CBS. Now, in the affluent surveys, when we look at this data, while we've seen decreases, and we showed you how well Netflix is doing against some of those companies, we've seen that the weekly viewership of the broadcast networks has been decreasing. However, we've seen somewhat similar or somewhat equivalent increases for those broadcast networks' streaming services. So they're keeping the network audiences somewhat whole. They're just shifting the paradigm, if you will, so that it is an at will or on my time exposure to the content. Despite all of this competition, and I think we're now in the Affluent survey measuring about 43 different streaming services, Netflix is still the dominant SVOD among affluents in terms of viewership and in terms of loyalty. So when we asked them if they could only subscribe to 3 of 12 services, we listed out the 12 services, Netflix was the first one selected by 44% of respondents. And that was almost 3 times the next closest competitor. In terms of the total top 3, Netflix was selected by almost 3/4 of respondents, while Amazon Prime was the choice for roughly half. HBO Max and Disney Plus are the next highest. It will be interesting to see what happens as HBO Max and Discovery Plus merge or share their content over the next couple of months as that enters its new phase. So since the competition for streaming dollars is really fierce, we wanted to look at the importance of specific features when it came to the decision on the part of affluents to sign up for a new subscription service. So in this instance, as we ask this question, we see that original movies and shows were really rated as extremely or very important items that were driven in part by men. So it's extremely important or to 2/3 of affluents, but the live sports news and TV shows really claim the importance crown. And you can see that for men, 53% of them are saying that live sports are very important or critically important, extremely important in the decision to take on a new service. It's not going to surprise anybody that while child-friendly programming doesn't seem very large for overall affluence, for parents, 65% of them say it's very, very important. So, as people are looking at the potential for losing subscribers or finding new ones, these are the critical factors that are going to help drive new sales. Now, there is a dirty little secret, and that is that 1 in 4 affluents share their account logins and passwords. And these are sharing with people who don't live in their households. Slightly more non-affluent households, about 1 in 3, share their passwords with others. And although lower, we do see that about 1 in 6 affluents access through someone else's account to get around the paywalls. Clearly, this is an issue that takes money away from the streaming services. And we know that at least, in some instances, they're trying to get in front of that. But, what remains to be seen is what will happen to their audiences in general, their ability to reach large mass audiences if they really tighten reins. So we were curious to see if there were some streaming services that were more severely impacted from the password sharing, but it's more or less consistent, with some slight variations, whether you're looking at Netflix or whether you're looking at Hulu with no commercials or Paramount Plus. It's a relatively narrow range. Most people are subscribing and keeping the login and the password within their own homes. A relatively small portion, but nevertheless a substantial enough to be a concern for the streaming services. Okay, so now let's turn over to binge watching, which I personally wish I could say that I was immune to. But the truth is, the vast majority of us come to, what I call the siren call of binge watching. This need to get to the next episode or to get to the next reveal, whatever it happens to be. Most affluents binge watch shows. 3/4 of them are watching several episodes in a single sitting. It's interesting to note that overall it's an increase of about it's an increase from 65% just from 2019. And it's likely to be even more prevalent based on the generational skew. We see, again, that Gen Zs are, 85% of them are binge watching versus 43% of seniors. And again, that comes back to this whole concept of Gen Z, grew up at a time where binge watching and streaming were readily available and part of their lives. So they didn't have to learn it. It was something that came naturally to them. It's not for the faint of heart. Binge watching is certainly not for the faint of heart, because on average, binge watchers are spending 2.9 hours in a sitting watching their favorite shows. And all of this takes a toll emotionally, with 43% of them saying they feel a void when they finished binging or finished watching a show that they've been binging. If you're not, thankfully the pool is deep, and the next show worthy of binging is really just on the horizon. It's only a matter of time. Of course, with this commitment of time and attention, it makes sense then, that as we look at it, the affluents are telling us they're more engaged with the shows they binge. They're committed to finishing all the episodes of one show before starting on the next one. And I have to confess that the next statement is one that I'm very guilty of as well, which is, I often stay up later than I really should or would to finish binge watching a show. I think, most of us have done that because it is one of those things that can be quite compelling, quite addictive. So moving away from binge watching, I know we're starting to run out of time. Let's spend a little time looking at what is capturing the attention of millennials in particular and Gen Zs, and that's podcasting. In the Affluent survey, we've been tracking podcasts for quite a while. Since 2018, we've seen the podcast audience grow from 29% to 45% of affluents. Millennials in particular have embraced this format more than any other generation, including their younger counterparts, Gen Zs. In our spring 2022 release, nearly 2/3 of millennials told us they watched or listened to a podcast in the past 30 days. Overall, 33% of affluent podcast listeners pay for at least one of their podcasts. And that number jumps to 54% of millennial podcast listeners. So not only are there more of them are listening to podcasts, but they are willing to pay for the content. During that same time, we've tracked the number of affluents who've seen or heard advertising in a podcast. And perhaps what's more is that at that same time, both exposure and interest in the advertising has grown. So, over time, as podcasts have become more sophisticated and the advertising that is on there has grown in terms of the types of advertising, the approach, we now see that there is considerable interest in that advertising. When affluents do find a podcast that they like, they're extremely loyal to that creator. So 28% say that they listen to every episode. Another 44% listen to most of the episodes. So you really do see that there's a deep connection among podcast listeners. Interestingly, listening to podcasts is really about a personal experience. Headphones in, listening to the podcast, about 85% of podcast listeners say they usually listen on their own. They're not listening as a group. They're overwhelmingly enjoying podcasts that make them think. 7 in 10 say that podcasts give them something they just can't get from TV, radio, or the web. Now, a smaller number, though a fairly substantial portion of affluents, see podcasts as their main source of entertainment and news. Again, this is among podcast listeners. Interestingly, 3 in 4 podcast listeners say that they're almost always doing something else, though, while they're listening. So their attention may be split between the podcast and their chores, or between the podcast and their driving, or whatever it happens to be. So it will be interesting to see just how attentive they are to the messages within the podcast. As with most forms of content, there's a wide variety of podcasts appealing to affluents. There's no overwhelming favorites among the many genres. Entertainment and comedy are still the 2 biggest podcast draws, but science, technology, and news are quite close. As with most things, word of mouth is really one of the primary ways in which people find new podcasts. Keeping in mind that podcasts appeal mostly to the younger generations, a close second to face-to-face word of mouth really comes from posts on social media sites. So, anyone looking to get their podcasts or to expand the audiences for their podcasts really need to focus on the getting people to spread the word. So we're running out of time, and we've thrown a lot of information at you today, really focusing on the multiplicity of touch points, media touch points that affluents see every day, whether it's from video, audio, print, social media. So let's try to recap what you heard today. Clearly affluents are drawn to media for information. They want to be knowledgeable, but they also want a combination of excitement to pique their interest, as well as a place to relax and find some relief from the craziness surrounding them. There are 4 things to focus on. It's the first is really about the sober mood that affluents are facing right now. They're concerned about the state of the world. They're concerned about, in general, about the fate of the economy. They're generally confident about their own finances. They're less sure about the U.S. economy as a whole. And there is the possibility that they will pull back in expenditures, but some of that may just be emotional. We do know that the lower income, the mass affluent, feels this more than the ultra affluent, the wealthy side of the affluent spectrum. So as advice, we feel that companies should really focus those efforts on those higher incomes to stabilize their sales. Affluents treat media as a way to stay informed. So regardless of the format, the platform, they need that knowledge. They want information because information ultimately is power, especially in a world where markets are volatile. They need to understand how to face the future, what to do with their assets, how to manage their portfolios, so on and so on. So, when we look at these things, high income earners in general, asset holders, they're going to turn to information sources they trust that are going to help them deal with what we call the vagaries of economic change. As I said, there's a desire for respite, whether they're binging, escapist programming, or whether there's looking at glossy travel magazines or fashion publications in order to get some relief from the pressures of the world, affluents are going to continue to seek refuge in media brands. So that close attachment that they have to these brands is really going to produce a wonderful halo effect for advertisers, generally positioning them in a very positive light. And then ultimately, as we say in most of these things, we have to be conscious of the changing of the guard. As millennials and Gen Zs continue to claim their spots in the affluent population, content providers, marketers are going to need to further shift their creative approach. New forms, including immersive technologies, are going to be critical components of getting a strong content dissemination system set up. Marketers will ultimately have to refine their own strategies to help deal with the continued, what I call, micro-fragmentation of audiences. So I know that that's a lot. We've spent quite a bit of time. I appreciate all of you staying with us. I know we didn't get to your questions, but if you've got questions, we will get back to you through email. So again, thank you all for your time. We hope you found this valuable and enjoy the rest of your day.